The coast of Jamaica doesn't announce itself with grandeur. It doesn't rise like cliffs or impose like a fortress wall of stone. It arrives low and hot and bright, the air thick with salt and the sweet sting of sun on wet wood. In the middle of the 17th century, to most of Europe, Jamaica was not yet a legend. It was a prize still being argued over, still being bruised into usefulness, still raw with possibility and risk. What mattered most, what made the island valuable beyond its future plantations, was the sea around it. The Caribbean was a living artery of commerce and conquest: Spanish silver, sugar cargoes, weapons, and the steady, ruthless movement of empire. Whoever controlled the sea lanes controlled the shape of the New World, and that was the first secret of the narrow strip of sand called the Palisadoes, a thin, curved spit shielding a deep natural harbor, like a clenched arm guarding its heart. The harbor was perfect, protected from storms, deep enough for big ships, and positioned at a crossroads of maritime traffic. The location itself wasn't moral or immoral. It was simply useful, but usefulness is a kind of temptation. In 1655, English forces took Jamaica from Spain, not with a grand campaign, but with the messy, humid desperation of imperial ambition. For over a century, Spain had gorged on Mexico and Peru, feeding Europe with the wealth of the Americas. English captains had watched that flow like starving men watching a river. Jamaica sitting like a fist near the Spanish mainwas, a doorway to theft. The English arrived as soldiers and opportunists, their minds fixed on survival. They needed a foothold, a defense, and a harbor where their ships could breathe. So the fort came first. It was practical, not glamorous, wooden structures and earthworks, with cannons set like teeth. At first it was simply meant to keep Spain from returning. The fear that the Spanish fleet would come back and wipe them from the island lived under every ration and every shovel of dirt. But fear breeds invention. They couldn't keep a colony alive on fear alone. They needed men who would fight, men who knew the sea better than Spanish captains, men who wouldn't mind bleeding, stealing, or vanishing into the horizon after the job was done. And so, the fort began to attract a different type of population. Privateers, first men licensed by the crown to prey on Spanish shipping. The word privateer sounded civilized enough, but the men themselves were often pirates in everything but paperwork. They were hungry, reckless, and skilled. To the English, they were a useful weapon. To the Spanish, they were vermin. The fort on the Palisadoes began to change. A handful of soldiers became a community. A community became a market. Ships arrived not only with cannons, but with barrels of rum, sacks of flour, powder, and nails. There were carpenters, then sailmakers, then blacksmiths. There were men who could stitch a wound, and men who could sell you one. And then, once men began to believe the fort was permanent, there were women. They came because life pulled them as wives, servants, or simply because the Caribbean economy forced them to become useful in the way men demanded. That is how a place becomes a city, not with a single founding moment, but with the constant addition of needs. A bed, a meal, a drink, a gamble, a repair. The English began to call the growing settlement Port Royal. The name itself carried ambition, as if the crown's shadow could tame the hunger that gathered there. But the crown was far away, and distance in the 17th century was a gap wide enough to swallow morality. To understand what Port Royal became, you have to understand what it was at the start. A border place, not quite a colony, not quite a military base, not quite a pirate hideout. It was all of them at once, stitched together by the logic of survival and profit. In a border place, virtues are negotiable. Ships used the harbor because it was convenient. The harbor made money. The money attracted more ships. That circle tightened like a noose around restraint. English merchants arrived, smelling the future. Trade in the Caribbean was not clean. Goods changed ownership with a handshake, a knife, or a cannon shot. A man could arrive penniless and leave with a cargo hold full of stolen Spanish goods, or he could leave with nothing but fever and a shallow grave. But the ones who survived, the ones who came back with Coinsby, came the advertisements. There is a particular kind of energy that gathers around sudden wealth. It intoxicates even those who don't yet have it. Sailors spend their pay as quickly as it's earned because tomorrow is not promised. In Port Royal, all of those instincts overlapped. Every street was fed by that same philosophy. Take what you can now. The fort expanded. The settlement's buildings grew more confident. Wooden shacks became sturdier structures. The docks extended like fingers into the harbor. Warehouses appeared, and with warehouses came thieves. With thieves came fights. and with fights came a need for more rum. Spain did not ignore Jamaica. Spanish raids, and rumors of raids, haunted the island. But that threat, oddly, worked in Port Royal's favor. Danger made the place relevant. It justified the privateers. It kept England pouring resources into Jamaica's defense, and it gave the city's most lawless men something priceless: legitimacy. When a privateer ship returned after tearing into a Spanish convoy, its captain wasn't treated like a criminal. He was a predator who had done what predators do best. The city praised him. Merchants welcomed him. Officials negotiated with him. He paid duties, and the money went into the colony's coffers. Everyone fed from the same kill. The early days of Port Royal were therefore a story of compromise. English governors were forced to accept that they could not build a Caribbean stronghold using only disciplined soldiers and pious settlers. They needed violent men. They needed the sea wolves, the ones who would sail into danger with a grin. So the settlement became a magnet for the displaced and the daring. Runaways, debtors, men fleeing warrants, men fleeing themselves. The Caribbean was full of such ghosts, and Port Royal welcomed them. Every new body meant another pair of hands to load cargo, build docks, fight Spanish raids, and spend money as if it were cursed. And the money did feel cursed sometimes. Gold and silver came into Port Royal in a fevered stream, not just through trade, but through prizes, captured ships, stolen coin, jewelry stripped from bodies. One man's salvation was another man's ruin. It was impossible to separate wealth from violence, because violence was the method of acquisition. When you walked through the settlement, you could already sense what it was learning to be. You could smell it, tar and sweat on the docks, rum souring in open barrels, the salty stink of drying fish, blood under the fingernails of sailors, cheap, heavy perfume clinging to women who had learned how to sell warmth in a city that treated tenderness like a commodity. The law wasn't absent. Exactly. It existed, but it moved slowly, and it was easily distracted by coin. A bribe could soften a punishment. A governor could pretend not to see a stolen cargo if it helped keep Spanish power at bay. Morality became something for speeches, but rarely for decisions. Port Royal's earliest wealth built its confidence. Confidence built its appetite, and appetite demanded more. By the 1660s, the harbour was no longer just a defensive asset, it was a marketplace of war. Privateering became structured, almost industrial. Investors put money into voyages, expecting either ruin or incredible return. And when those ships returned, the city rewarded them. Port Royal began to build itself around the cycle of departure and return, like a lung breathing in pirates and breathing out plunder. There was no single moment when the fort became a city, when the city became something infamous. It was gradual, and that gradualness is what made it dangerous. People adjusted to small compromises the way they adjust to heat. First uncomfortable, then normal, then unnoticeable. A tavern becomes respectable when officials drink there. A pirate becomes useful when he bleeds for the crown. And so Port Royal, still young, still wooden, still clinging to sand, began to tilt toward its destiny. The sandbar settlement was thriving. Ships lined its harbor. Deals were made in shadowy rooms. Rum flowed through throats that would soon be cut. The fort's cannons stood watch, not only against Spain, but against any force that might threaten the city's growing prosperity. They did not yet call it the most sinful city on earth, but sin, like wealth, announces itself early in its scent and rhythm. A place that didn't just endure the chaos of the Caribbean, but mastered it, sold it, drank it, and prepared to become its beating heart. Long before it was known as the wickedest city on earth, Port Royal was a simple fortified harbor. But as it grew, it discovered a fundamental truth about itself. Vice wasn't just a side effect of its success, it was the engine driving it. The streets didn't accidentally fill with taverns and gaming tables. They were built because they worked. They kept sailors spending, privateers loyal, and money flowing so fast it washed away any doubt. The city spread out from the docks like an ink spill. Narrow lanes twisted and turned, shaped by foot traffic, not by city planners. Buildings made of timber leaned against each other, as if sharing drunken secrets, constantly patched up just enough to keep from falling down. Fire was a constant worry, but not enough to slow down the pursuit of profit. When money is made today, the risks of tomorrow feel like someone else's problem. Port Royal's geography made indulgence easy. Squeezed by the sea on both sides, the city was incredibly compact. A sailor could step off his ship, sell stolen Spanish goods, drink himself into a stupor, lose all his pay at a dice table, find companionship for the night, get into a fight, and wake up in a guttural without ever leaving a few city blocks. The city didn't spread out. It pressed in on itself, and that pressure cooked everything to a fever pitch. First came the taverns, not fancy inns, but loud, sweaty rooms where the rum was poured, thick and cheap. Rum was the fuel of the Caribbean, a spirit distilled from sugar and suffering, and in Port Royal they drank it like water. The air was a thick stew of tobacco smoke, spilled liquor, wet wool, and unwashed bodies. Fiddles and drums provided a rough soundtrack, with singing that often blurred into shouting. Deals were struck over stained tables, and feuds began that ended with knives, not words. Gambling was the next logical step. Dice, cards, bets on anything and everything. Men who had stared death in the face on the high seas weren't exactly cautious on land. A purse heavy with silver felt unreal until it was either spent or lost. The city's entire psychology encouraged this boom or bust mentality. A fortune could be made or lost in a single night, and either outcome sent a man right back to the docks, hungry for another voyage. Brothels were everywhere, some openly advertised, others hidden in the back rooms of taverns and lodging houses. This wasn't a world of romance, it was purely transactional. The work was dangerous, and the women's lives were governed by the same brutal economics that ruled the men. Disease spread like wildfire, and violence was a constant threat. But so was money, and in a city where tomorrow was never guaranteed, immediate profit was worth the risk. Of course, there were priests and churches in Port Royal, but they fought a losing battle against rum and gold. Sermons about damnation were often drowned out by the noise from the gambling den next door. The clergy quickly learned that moral outrage was a luxury. Even the most pious had to compromise, because it was the city's sinful wealth that paid for its defenses, its repairs, and yes, even their own salaries. Officially, the English crown governed Port Royal, but in reality, the rules were loose and highly negotiable. Laws sent from England were often outdated by the time they arrived. The city's governors had an impossible job: maintain order, grow the economy, defend against Spain, and keep London happy, all with a population that thrived on disobedience. Their solution was simple: selective enforcement. A drunken brawl that ended in a dead sailor might get you a short stay in a cell, but not if you were a valuable seaman. Smuggling was technically illegal, but when everyone was doing it, who could you arrest? Bribery became part of the daily routine. These officials didn't see themselves as corrupt, they saw themselves as realists. The Caribbean wasn't England. It was hotter, harsher, and far more violent. They believed that strict English morality would simply choke the colony to death. Better a thriving, sinful city than a righteous, bankrupt ruin. The privateers were the key to this whole system. England's conflicts with Spain were often undeclared wars fought in the shadows. Privateering gave England plausible deniability. When a privateer captured a Spanish treasure ship, English officials could claim ignorance while pocketing a share of the profits. Captured goods flooded Port Royal's markets: silver coins, cacao, hides, wine, and weapons. Even sacred church ornaments were melted down, their holy purpose reborn as cold, hard cash. The city became a surprisingly efficient clearinghouse for state-sponsored piracy. Plunder was assessed, taxed, and redistributed. Investors got their returns, sailors got their shares, and the tavern keepers, prostitutes, and shop owners all got a piece of the action. The money passed through so many hands so quickly that its bloody origins were soon forgotten. Blood dries, but gold always shines. As the wealth piled up, so did the city's confidence. Buildings grew taller, bolder. Some were even made of brick, an act of pure arrogance, given the sandy ground they were built on. Balconies and painted shutters appeared. Crude signs advertised all manner of services. Port Royal wanted to be seen as a permanent city, not just a temporary camp for pirates. With that permanence came families. Children played in the same streets where brawls erupted every night. Wives waited for husbands who sailed away on voyages they might never return from. This domestic life didn't soften the city, it just made it more complicated. Respectability and depravity lived side by side, often in the same house. Port Royal's reputation began to travel the world. Sailors in faraway European ports spoke of it with a mix of awe and desire. It was a place where rules didn't apply. The pay was good, and pleasure was cheap and always available. Two men stuck in the rigid social classes of the old world, Port Royal sounded like freedom, but freedom in Port Royal was a dangerous thing. It belonged only to those who could survive the city's relentless pace. Those who drank too much, gambled too recklessly, or trusted the wrong person often ended up ruined or dead. Disease was a silent killer. Fevers swept through the crowded streets where sanitation was an afterthought and fresh water was a luxury. The dead were buried quickly and without ceremony. Violence wasn't shocking, it was normal. Duels were common. Arguments escalated in a heartbeat. Everyone was armed with knives, pistols, or cutlasses. In a city full of armed men, many of them half drunk and fresh from combat, peace was just the quiet moment between fights. The nights were a symphony of shouts, laughter, and screams. And yet, despite all this chaos, or maybe because of it, Port Royal flourished. Its harbour was one of the busiest in the New World. Ships lined up, waiting for a space to dock. Warehouses overflowed. The city's wealth dwarfed that of more civilized colonies. London took notice. The English crown tolerated behaviour it would never allow at home, because Port Royal delivered results. Spain noticed, too. For the Spanish Empire, Port Royal was a bleeding wound, a pirate nest that siphoned its wealth into English hands. They complained, they protested, they threatened, but their empire was vast and overstretched. Spanish fleets sometimes attacked, but Port Royal's forts were strong, and its privateers were masters of hit-and-run tactics. This constant threat from Spain only reinforced the city's logic. As long as Spain was the enemy, Port Royal's lawlessness could be justified as a necessary evil. The taverns and brothels kept up morale. Privateering was just another form of defense. Corruption was just flexibility. By the late 1660s, Port Royal had fully become itself. It wasn't pretending anymore. Visitors were warned, preachers denounced it, sailors dreamed of it, and merchants got rich from it. The city was a machine, perfectly designed to turn danger into money, and money into pleasure. Its streets ran on pure appetite. Appetite for gold, for drink, for flesh, for risk. Life moved fast because nothing was guaranteed. The sea could kill you, a Spanish cannonball could find you, a fever could take you in a week. So people lived like tomorrow was just a rumor. This was the culture that made Port Royal a legend. Its wickedness wasn't an accident. It was an organized, efficient, and wildly profitable business model. At its heart was an uneasy alliance between an empire and its outlaws. The English flag flew over a city that thrived on everything England publicly condemned. Governors shook hands with men who would be hanged as pirates anywhere else. Sermons about God echoed off walls built with stolen gold. Port Royal had become something unique, a place where vice wasn't hidden in the shadows, but displayed, traded, and taxed in the open. The wickedest city in the world wasn't ashamed of itself. It believed its wickedness was what kept it alive. And as more ships arrived, carrying more men hardened by the sea and hungry for excess, Port Royal sailed toward its peak, a time when its name would be spoken with fear and awe, and when gold and blood would flow so freely that it seemed even the ground beneath the city could unhold it all forever. Port Royal wasn't just a city of sin, it became a capital of opportunity, and that is always more dangerous. Sin can be hidden in alleys. Opportunity builds empires. By the time the city reached its peak, the harbor wasn't just crowded, it was alive. Imagine a dense forest of shipmasts, with sails drying in the sun like pale skins. The air was thick with sound, the groan of ropes, the slap of water against hulls, the clatter of cargo, and the constant shouts of dockmasters and sailors. This was the era when the myth of Port Royal truly began. Not because the stories were exaggerated, but because reality itself had become extreme. The city had discovered a formula: wars plus privateering plus indulgence equals prosperity. And once a place finds a winning formula, it repeats it until it breaks. At the heart of this was the brilliantly profitable partnership between English authorities and the sea predators they relied on. Privateers were, technically, legal. They carried letters of marque, slips of paper that turned theft into a patriotic duty, as long as you plundered Spanish ships and shared the spoils with the crown. But in the Caribbean, force was respected far more than paperwork. The line between a celebrated privateer and a hunted pirate was often just a matter of timing and politics. Port Royal adjusted its morals as quickly as it adjusted market prices, without a second thought. In the taverns along the waterfront, captains held court. These men weren't kings, but they had the same aura of power, earned through fear and success. They dressed flamboyantly in stolen silks and gold thread, with heavy rings on their calloused fingers. Their faces were weathered, their eyes narrowed from sun glare and constant suspicion. Gentleness doesn't survive long at sea. When a successful captain returned, the whole city felt it. Cargo was unloaded, loot was counted, and merchants bid on goods that still smelled of seawater and gunpowder. Tavern keepers stocked extra barrels of rum. Everyone got a piece of the action. It wasn't just the stolen goods that made Port Royal rich. It was the entire ecosystem built around them. Every expedition employed shipwrights, carpenters, gunners, and sailors. Every crew needed rum, food, and entertainment. In a brutal way, it was sustainable violence. The wars of Europe spilled into this world like ink into water. Treaties signed in distant palaces took months to reach the Caribbean, and even then, they were often ignored. By the time news arrived that England and Spain were technically at peace, dozens of privateers were already at sea, hunting Spanish prey. The sea didn't stop for politics, and men didn't stop for paper. This delay created a grey zone where Port Royal thrived. Officials could claim they hadn't received the latest orders. Privateers could claim they believed war was still on. Everyone benefited from the confusion, as long as the gold remained solid. It was during these years that names like Henry Morgan began to echo across the waves. A Welshman, Morgan became the most famous privateer in the Caribbean, embodying all of Port Royal's contradictions. He was brutal yet strategic, an outlaw who was eventually knighted, a destroyer of Spanish towns celebrated by the English Empire. Morgan's raids were not small skirmishes. They were organized military campaigns. He gathered entire fleets, coordinated massive attacks, and struck deep into Spanish territory. When he captured and looted places like Portobello and later Panama, the sheer scale of the violence and the profit was staggering. The loot that flowed back to Port Royal after these raids did more than just enrich individuals. It inflated the city's sense of destiny. It made Port Royal feel untouchable, as if it were protected by its own audacity. In the taverns, men spoke of Morgan not just with admiration, but with hunger. Every successful raid was proof that more success was possible. The young and reckless wanted to be him. The cautious wanted to invest in him. And Morgan, like every successful man in Port Royal, just wanted more. More wealth, more status, more power. The city offered it all, but it demanded loyalty not to morality, but to the machine. Port Royal's streets became a collage of extremes. The richest merchants built grand homes with imported furniture, trying to replicate European comfort in the sweltering tropical heat. Meanwhile, sailors slept in crowded rooms above taverns or on the decks of their ships, and quietly supporting this city that bragged endlessly about freedom. Enslaved people toiled in warehouses and kitchens. Freedom in Port Royal meant the freedom for the powerful to do as they pleased. It was never universal. As wealth became more concentrated, the moral contradictions deepened. Some men who arrived as desperate sailors became wealthy landlords. But survival itself was a rare triumph, especially for the women of the city, whose lives were often short and brutal. Violence was a constant, but it became more professional. Crews formed tight loyalties, and a captain's men would defend his reputation in the streets with their knives. Justice was less about right and wrong, and more about who had more friends with weapons. Yet, the city's outward face glittered. In the daylight, the harbor looked like prosperity itself, with streets crowded with sugar, tobacco, and imported silks and lace. Rumors spread of men throwing coins on the floor just to watch others scramble for them. At night, the performance intensified. Lanterns flickered, music poured from every tavern, and the city's appetite for pleasure was on full display. The English flag flew above what was, in practice, one of the most efficient criminal economies in the world. This wasn't just decadence, it was a philosophy. Port Royal believed the world was chaotic and cruel, and the only sane response was to seize as much wealth and pleasure as you could, while you could. The city's sins weren't hidden in shame. They were celebrated as proof of survival, and because of this, the city felt immortal. As long as the privateers returned with Spanish gold, as long as the harbor stayed full, Port Royal seemed invincible. It was the beating heart of English power in the Caribbean and the nerve center of outlaw wealth, a city that had learned to turn violence into glamour. But invincibility is a fragile illusion. Port Royal's prosperity rested on unstable foundations, shifting politics, the constant threat of retaliation, and more literally than anyone wanted to admit, a city built on a narrow strip of sand. There were warnings. Fires would race through the wooden buildings. Hurricanes swept past, reminding everyone that nature didn't care about gold. But no one wanted to believe that their borrowed time could end so abruptly. In Port Royal, Tomorrow was always uncertain, but the present was intoxicating. The pirate crown of the Caribbean sat firmly on Port Royal's head, heavy with stolen metal. Gold moved through the streets like water, and blood soaked into the docks like spilled rum. The city grew more arrogant. Brick buildings rose higher, warehouses packed tighter, and more people arrived, all drawn by the magnet of wealth and lawlessness. The narrow strip of sand held them all, a crowded human fever dream balanced between sea and sky. Port Royal had reached that dangerous height where people stopped questioning the future. It had become a symbol of freedom, of corruption, of excess. The world watched with a mixture of fascination and disgust. Men whispered its name with longing. Preachers spat it like a curse. And then, without warning and without mercy, the earth beneath this symbol began to prepare its reply. In the late 17th century, one city was richer, rowdier, and more feared than any other in the Caribbean. Port Royal, Jamaica. It was a city built on gold, rum, and audacity. But the most dangerous thing Port Royal ever believed was not that it was untouchable. For decades, the city had taught itself to ignore warnings. It had survived fires, outmaneuvered Spanish fleets, and weathered brutal storms. History itself seemed to favor this little strip of sand, as if it was destined to prosper forever. So, the city built upward. Brick mansions replaced wooden shacks. Warehouses bulged with treasure. The air was a thick cocktail of rum, sweat, and sea spray. Beneath all this roaring success was a quiet, physical truth that no amount of confidence could change. Port Royal was built on sand. Literally, the entire city sat on a narrow spit of loose sediment. It was a foundation as unstable as the city's reputation. But it was easy to forget the ground when it felt so solid under your boots. Easy to assume that because buildings stood today, they would stand tomorrow. In Port Royal, optimism was rewarded, and hesitation was punished. To speak of collapse was to invite ridicule. Besides, everyone was busy getting richer, drinking harder, building bigger. The city wasn't dying, it was roaring at its peak. Then came the morning of June 7, 1692. It began like any other day. The sun rose over the harbor, merchants moved through the streets, and sailors drifted towards the taverns. Life continued in its familiar, chaotic rhythm. And then, around mid-morning, that rhythm snapped. The first tremor wasn't a gentle warning. It was violent and immediate. The earth bucked like an animal trying to throw a rider. People froze, thinking it was cannon fire or a storm. But the sound was wrung a deep, sickening roar rising from below. Buildings began to crack. Walls shuddered. Then, the real terror arrived. The ground didn't just shake, it liquefied. The sandy soil beneath Port Royal turned to soup under the immense pressure. Whole sections of the city began to slump and slide, as if the island itself was melting. Streets split open, wide enough to swallow people whole. Men ran, fell, and ran again, only to find the ground no longer supported them. A tavern, famous for its drunken songs, tilted like a sinking ship and slid completely into the sea. Houses crumpled like paper. The docks snapped. People drowned on what was, moments before, solid land. As if that wasn't enough, the sea responded. A tsunami surged into the harbor, not a towering cinematic wave, but a treacherous, violent flood that poured through the broken streets, carrying beams, barrels, and bodies with it. Ships tore loose from their anchors and were flung inland. The harbor, once Port Royal's greatest asset, had become part of the killing. The earthquake lasted for minutes that felt like hours. People watched their friends disappear, their homes vanish. They saw the city's arrogant permanence dissolve into chaos. In those moments, Port Royal's grand illusion that money and violence could outwit fate was exposed as nothing but bravado. When the shaking finally stopped, the city was unrecognizable. A huge portion of Port Royal had slid into the sea. The air was filled with the cries of the injured, the trapped, and the grieving. And then came the second cruelty: fire. Flames sparked in the wreckage and spread with hungry speed. Survivors stumbled through smoke, choking on the bitter taste of their burning city. There was no rescue effort, not at first. The officials, the soldiers, the clergy, they were victims too. Some tried to dig out the buried with their bare hands. Others, trained by Port Royal's greedy culture, looted the dead and dying. The dead were everywhere, floating in the harbor, piled in the streets, buried under ruins, too heavy to clear. Many were never recovered, sealed into the seabed, along with the city's stolen gold. In the days that followed, disease and starvation set in. Survivors believed they were witnessing divine judgment. After all, Port Royal had long been called the most wicked city on earth, and now it lay broken, half of it sunk beneath the waves. But to call it judgment is to overlook a simpler truth. Nature doesn't punish, it just moves. Port Royal never recovered. The economic heart of the English Caribbean shifted to the safer shores of Kingston. The city that was once a roaring giant became a cautionary echo, but the sea kept its trophies. Beneath the water, parts of Port Royal remain preserved in strange stillness: trees, foundations, bottles, plates, coins, pieces of ordinary life, trapped by extraordinary catastrophe. This underwater ruin is the most honest monument to what Port Royal truly was. Not a romantic pirate paradise, but a city built with breathtaking speed on unstable ground, morally, politically, and physically. A place that lived as if tomorrow was optional, only to discover, on a single morning, that tomorrow could be erased altogether. What remained was not just ruin, but silence. A silence broken only by waves brushing the shore, where streets once ran, where dice once rolled, where voices once shouted drunken boasts into the humid night air. The world had, for a moment, seemed to open its mouth and swallow the city whole. Thanks for watching.